This will be part 2 of the Christian worldview. We will look at 3 in total: the Christian, the Eastern worldview, and the scientific worldview. This will be the second lesson about Christianity. We learned that the metaphor in the Christian worldview is the world is an artifact. God created the earth and all living things on it. So they were created with parts, with purposes, the living things were, and a home in which to live. In particular, God created humans at some time in the past. Here we see the famous Michelangelo painting of God sort of bringing to life Adam. And we were made in the image of God, we humans. Now, there are important implications to this worldview. For Christians, then, this view gives meaning and purpose to a human life. Christians stand in great appreciation for their own existence, and they worship their Creator. In addition, for Christians, humans are not just another kind of animal. We are intelligent and moral because we were made in God's image, and God is intelligent and moral. So God gave us certain attributes that God did not give to the other animals and plants and so on. In the remainder of the lesson, then, we'll take a look at how the Christians approached these puzzles that faced naturalists in the 1800s. So why so many different species on Earth? Now here again, in answering these questions from the Christian point of view, we have to just speculate because it requires getting inside God's mind, and what human can do that. But we will just speculate nonetheless. So perhaps God delighted in designing many different kinds of species. So we see lots of different kinds of animals and plants because this delighted God. In addition, we heard from William Paley, who argued that living things were designed, and he wrote a famous book called Natural Theology, in which he laid out the design argument. In brief, if we look at a watch like this here, and we notice it has parts that have purposes, the different parts have different jobs to do. Well, for Paley, if a part has a purpose, it only has a purpose because it was designed to have that purpose by an intelligent mind. But then when we look at living things, we also see parts with purposes: the eyes and the nose and the ears and the stomach and lungs, etc. They have purposes. Well, if the parts of a watch had to have an intelligent mind to give them purpose, so too for living things. When we see parts with purposes, that requires an intelligent mind to design them, an intelligent designer. This is the design argument. And so we saw the praying mantis has spikes on its forelimbs to help it capture and immobilize prey. These would be parts with purpose. They were designed by God to achieve a purpose, and then God made them. Hence we have that 2-step process where purpose precedes the part itself. So God designs the spikes to have a certain purpose to catch prey, and then God makes mantises with those spikes. So living things distinguish themselves by having parts with purpose because the living things were designed and created by God. Now God might have made the other non-living things as well, but those things were not given parts with purpose. Living things were given parts with purpose as a marker of God's intelligent design. So how did purpose enter the universe? The Christian answer is going to be God's intelligence. Now we're going to introduce a diagram here to better illustrate the Christian worldview. At the top of the diagram, we see some giraffes here. We have some chimps. I have a chimp and a human. So these would be 3 different species. For the Christian, then, God made each of these species separately in a separate act of creation. So God designed each species and then made the first of each species at some time in the past. And we're going to call this the special creation hypothesis. So we can think of the living things as examples of intelligent designs. All of these species have parts with purposes that had to be designed by God. Now, the way God did this, thought the Christian, was that God sort of had a design plan in mind, and we're going to give a name to that. We're going to call it an essence. So each species had an essence, the design plan that God used to make the first members of that species. And the essence basically is sort of like the blueprint for the species, or it's a set of defining traits, defining characteristics of the species, like their unique adaptations. So for example, the giraffe has the long neck, and the chimps have the long long arms and grasping hands and feet, and the humans have the big brains and they can use language, etc. So these would be defining features of the species, and that would be part of the essence of each species. So God designs, in a sense, in God's mind, the defining features of the species, and then creates each species in a separate act of creation. We call that the special creation hypothesis. Now, importantly, the essence of a species was fixed. So God's design plan, carried by all members of a species, was unchangeable. So once God made the giraffes, they stayed giraffes. So since the essence of a species could not change, species could never change over time. The first members of each species could reproduce, but always making offspring of the same species. So God made the first giraffes and included male and female giraffes so they could make babies, but the babies were always giraffes. God made the first male and female chimps, the babies were always chimps. God made the first male and female humans, the babies were always humans. If we start today and go back in time, giraffes were always giraffes, chimps were always chimps, humans were always humans, all the way back to the mind of God. And we can use a geometry analogy here then. We can say that the lines of ancestry are parallel. Parallel lines of ancestry. There was never any convergence of these ancestry lines in the past. Let's move on to other questions. Why extinction? Why did some species go extinct? Why are there no trilobites anymore or T-Rexes? Well, God had God's reasons, perhaps unknowable to humans. Why can organisms be grouped? So, for example, here we have 4 different species of birds. Why can they be grouped into a bird category? And here the Christian had a little bit more sophisticated answer. The idea was that God made slight modifications to a general bird body plan, thus creating many different bird species, but they all shared many traits. So you can imagine sort of God designing, birds, and God's thinking, okay, I want to make some birds. And so you have just the general plan of a generalized bird, and then you tweak the little characteristics to make separate species. In the case of the ostrich, the wings don't actually function for flight, but in the other birds they do. These would be minor adjustments of the general bird body plan. Why are humans unique? Well, humans were made in the image of God, and so we have qualities that are not possessed by other animals, like our intelligence, language, and morality. Why aging and death? Well, for the Christians, they have a story about death, and that goes back to the Garden of Eden and a disobedience in the Garden of Eden. So death was the penalty for human sin. It wasn't God's fault. And we'll see this contrasts with the scientific worldview, where death has a natural history. So the Christian worldview does have sort of answers to these questions, albeit they are answers that are difficult to really be secure with because it requires getting inside God's mind. But for species origin, diversity, and number, it's God's preference. God wanted to have a world populated with living things, and the millions of different species we see might reflect God's desire, God's preference for lots of different kinds of creatures. The appearance of design, the adaptations that we see, the parts with purpose, how do we explain that? Well, the Christian says God's intelligence. Species extinction, why species disappear? Again, God's preference. God wanted the trilobites and the T-Rexes to disappear, perhaps to replace them with something else later. The groupishness of species, for the Christian, this is a result of God's design process. God thinks up of a certain, bird design, and then tweaks that bird design to make lots of different bird species. Human origins and uniqueness, again, God's preference. God chose us to have characteristics that God shared as well. So we were made in God's image, different from other animals. And aging and death, the Christians have a story about that involving human sin.